Cool. Well, thank you, everyone. So I am going to be talking to you about user research today. I have a background in design and front-end development. Currently, I work as somewhere between a service designer and user experience designer with a lot of user research. But today I want to focus on the user research. So I particularly want to talk about how user research can really help us as designers and developers. I taught myself user research because actually I was struggling in those roles and I was struggling to do things that I thought were valuable. So I'm going to show you a little bit about how I helped myself in that situation. And I'm going to show you some quick methods that you can apply to almost any existing service or product or app to get some value out of the data that you already have or the access that you already have to users who are using live services. So first of all, I want to talk about why it's valuable to us as designers and developers. And for me, that's because most of us are plagued by something that I like to call opinion-driven design. Now, probably at some point in your career, likely in the last month, maybe even in the last week, you've experienced the joys of opinion-driven design. Now, opinion-driven design are decisions, design decisions based on the opinions of our colleagues, managers, our clients, and our stakeholders. They are based on subjective opinions and not objective data. So why is this actually a problem? Well, we all need to make decisions every day, and we don't want to get too held up making those decisions. We can't always have massive reams of user research to help us decide what the best way forward is. But the problem is when we don't have any, we are entirely relying on our subjective opinions. And subjective opinions, from the nature of them being subjective, rarely align. Now, this is particularly true if we're working in a team. The point of us working in a team is to work with people with different experience and insight to contribute. But sometimes that experience and insight leads us to come to different conclusions about what the best decision to move things forward actually is. So when we can't agree, and probably you've all experienced this too, often it's the highest paid opinion in the room, our managers, our clients, or our stakeholders who get to break the tie. So we're back to our subjective opinions again. Now, being in this situation can lead us to being forced to prioritize features based on internal wants and needs instead of what our users' needs are, instead of what their priorities are. It can mean that we make design and language decisions based on our project leader preferences rather than what makes most sense to the people that we think we're actually building for. And it means that we can become forced to rush the implementation of our features. We aren't really considering the best experience for our users, just the speed at which we can deliver something for our managers. Because actually, when we aren't thinking about our users, when we don't understand what their needs are, it's our managers and our clients that we're really designing for. Then if we go and try to measure the success of the things that we've built, we have to focus on easily quantifiable things that aren't really very useful, like the uptime of our services or the number of page views on a page, instead of or as well as how useful they actually are for our users, because we don't really know what to measure that against in the first place. So for most of us, this sucks pretty hard. Our expertise is ignored, we're railroaded into building things that we don't really agree with, and we'll probably never have the opportunity to know whether that decision that was seemingly forced upon us was a good one or not. Now, what do we do in this situation? Well, I found that the only way to counter subjective opinions is with objective data. But if you've ever asked to spend time to understand more about your users, rather than to go on and build new and shiny things without really understanding who we're building for, you may have heard some of these excuses if you've been told no. We just don't have the time, the money, or the people to be doing research. We already have a site that people use. Why do I need to know more or anything about those people? And my personal favorite, which is we already know what our users want. Thank you. So this third answer is usually based in overconfidence, right? It's rarely based on any kind of research. Because for those of us who actually do regular research, we know that we can never really know what the current state of play is. All we have to do is change a feature, update, or improve it, and we don't know what that new user experience looks like. And there's also things like how user needs just fundamentally change over time. All we have to do is look at the transition from mobile to desktop to really understand this in a very feasible and physical way. So we can't really know what our users want. This is a myth. We only know this, and we only know parts of it from doing regular research. And I'd say that most organizations I've worked with don't know enough about the behavior or needs of their users. And sometimes this is based in that overconfidence. They genuinely believe that they do already know what their users want. Sometimes it's a perceived lack of opportunity. They feel that they don't have enough time or ability to be able to go out and understand more. So the key point that I'd like you to take away from this talk, if absolutely nothing else, if you have a bit of a snooze in the middle, that's fine, is that user research really doesn't have to be time-consuming, difficult, or expensive. In fact, I'd argue that if all of the research we're doing is time-consuming, difficult, and expensive, then we'll never be current enough in our understanding to be able to really know what's going on with our users. So sometimes the more lightweight methodologies can be the best. But for this reason, I feel that there's no excuse as an organization not to be doing at least some user research. So today I'm going to give you 3 quick and dirty methodologies that you can apply almost straight away on almost any of your projects that already exist. And I believe that these will help you to combat opinion-driven design if you're suffering from it. And they can help prove to your colleagues and bosses, should you so wish to, that research doesn't have to be time-consuming or difficult, and that it is genuinely within everyone's grasp. So, the first methodology that I would like to talk to you about is usability feedback through complaints and bug reports. Bug reports, where no functional bug can be identified, are a potential source of user feedback. But in order to use bug reports as feedback, we need to accept that the problem does not exist between chair and keyboard. Now, for those of you unfamiliar with this term, it's usually problem exists between chair and keyboard, and you may have heard it shortened to PEBCAC. Now, we refer to reports as PEBCAC when a functional bug can't be found, and fundamentally what we're saying is the user is using it wrong. But in reality, it's more likely that we have a usability issue with our product or service. So if you've been handling reports that you've labeled as PEBCAC or thought of as PEBCAC or any of the similar acronyms that exist, it's quite likely that you've been unknowingly handling usability feedback. Now, in most organizations I've worked with, these reports are handled on a very individual basis. Someone will report a problem, will perhaps send them to the help documentation, will tell them how to use it correctly, and then we'll close down the ticket if it came in that way, and we'll pretend like it never happened. And this is a really missed opportunity. Much the same can be said of complaints. Complaints are a fantastic form of feedback, born of frustration and dissatisfaction. And they can really reveal some of the best insights in some of the worst pain points in our users' experiences. Or sometimes they also indicate a mismatch in product expectations. It's not so much a usability issue as much as a user expects to see a piece of functionality which isn't there for them. So, with bug reports and complaints, we can identify potential usability issues in our interfaces. We can identify those kinds of mismatches in product features and user expectation. An example of this would be that a user uploads a photo and believes that they should have the ability to crop it. They may complain if this feature doesn't appear to be working, even though it's not one that we've actually built. And we can also reduce the amount, and perhaps this is the most day-to-day value for us as developers and designers, of non-functional bug reports and complaints that we receive from our users. Because the great thing is, once we've identified those usability issues, we can do something to fix them and stop the trigger that creates those reports. And the best thing about this is it genuinely is probably the most simple methodology that I'm going to show you today. The only thing we have to do to kick this process off is just to record reports in a system that allows you to tag them. That's it. So we can do this in a help desk. We can even do this in an email account if that's the way that we are receiving our reports. Now, the reason that we tag it is that we want to be able to find our reports again easily. So we want to tag the reports with appropriate labels to be able to do that quickly. For example, usability and the fact that it happened on the login page. And if you're using something like a help desk like Zendesk, we can even set automated reminders to check back on how many reports we've got. So what we want to do is keep on tagging them until we have enough to analyze. So what do we do when we've got enough to analyze? Well, what we'd want to do is have a look for patterns and themes in our bug reports or our complaints that might indicate that we have an underlying usability issue. These are 3 example bug reports, and they're all reporting the same issue. Now, it's fairly easy to work out that there is a consistent issue here because the user need is fundamentally the same. People want to make a payment, and as far as they can see from the interface, that payment hasn't happened. The debt is still showing the same amount, the payment hasn't shown up, it isn't showing up on my statement. So even though we've gone through the process here of establishing that there are no bugs, that these payments have gone through, but there's something in the interface that is causing users to believe that there is a bug or an error here. So the pattern in this example, and this is another three examples, is slightly more difficult to work out, but you can do it when you have a look at the tags, because we can see that everything happens on the profile page. But actually, fundamentally, the user need in each of these points is slightly different. The first person wants to update their address, the second person wants to update their surname, and the third person wants to update their profile photo. But when we look at them all together, we can see quite quickly that there is some kind of a consistent pattern. The button won't work, I can't seem to make the change, the page won't save it. So when we're looking at this, we can surmise that perhaps there's something like a field validation error in the page that is stopping users from submitting their content, but probably isn't visible enough to see. It could be something even simpler than that. It could be that someone is accidentally clicking the cancel button rather than the submit button because actually, for some reason or another, one of them is more visually prominent. So once we have identified that we do have a pattern and a probable usability issue, we can go and do a little bit of research to work out what the most likely cause is. So how many reports like this do we actually need to collect before we can be sure there is an issue? Well, for certain, an individual bug report or complaint is not enough to give us certainty of an issue. But we need to remember that not everyone has the time or the motivation to provide feedback or log bugs. Many users will find a workaround, or they will find a different product or site to complete their task on. So the users who do go to the effort of reporting are likely going to be representative of a much larger group of people who have experienced the issue and haven't taken the time to tell us about it, perhaps because they didn't find it particularly necessary to report. So for this reason, there isn't an easy answer on how many reports really constitute a serious issue here. But our sample are those users who have both experienced the issue and been motivated enough to report it. So what causes motivation in this situation? Well, motivation might come through something like severity. For example, if a payment seems to have gone astray, that's pretty serious. It might be because we made it very easy to report the issue, and I'll talk a bit more about how we can do that later. And it may come through repeated frustration, having to use a system that seemingly fools you at every turn. But to give you some sense of scale on how many reports you might want to look at, if we had 300 users on a non-critical site, and by non-critical, I mean something that isn't payment processing, that people aren't reliant on to be able to do their job. So we've got 300 users on a non-critical site, and we get 3 reports that show the consistent likelihood of a usability error. So with 3 reports out of 300, I'd say that that definitely warrants further investigation. If you had 10 reports out of 300 on a non-critical site, you've probably got a very serious usability issue. Because remember, for each of those 3 or 10 people reporting, there's likely a much larger group of people behind them who have experienced that issue and not told us about it. So what it comes down to is that although it is difficult to deal with if you've ever worked on a help desk, and I know it is, users who report issues in anger are unintentionally doing us a favor. Their effort and their anger helps us to identify issues that might otherwise go unnoticed. So it's important to repay that effort by listening to them and responding to their feedback, whether it's intentional feedback or not. And as I said before, the best benefit that it perhaps has to us day to day as developers is that once we've established what those issues are that are triggering reports, we can stop them from happening. So, complaint and bug report analysis can help us to identify usability issues. And we can do this by looking for repeated patterns in bug reports and complaints that have no functional cause. They can help us to potentially identify product misunderstandings by identifying expectations from users that don't align with the current site functionality. Arguably, the credit card payment that hasn't appeared in your statement is in fact a mismatched expectation from users and the system. The system won't make it appear immediately because the payment processing doesn't happen immediately, but users expect to see it there. And it will also help us to reduce complaints and bug reports by resolving the issues that trigger them. So, how long does it actually take to do? Well, there's no development time here beyond tagging the reports as they come into our help desk or email account as they would normally. And the analysis time is going to be variable depending on the scale of reports. But for less than 10 reports, you're probably talking less than 30 minutes to have a look at them, identify a pattern, and go and double check what we think is causing it. So the next method that I would like to talk to you about is user feedback through transaction audits. Now, a transaction audit allows us to capture feedback from users at the point of success or failure. Transaction audits are usually single questions or short forms that we ask users to fill in at the end of their journey, and you've probably come across them before. They're most commonly seen in help documentation pages. So this is an example from the Microsoft documentation pages. If you wanted to go and check this out, just to see what an example looked like, I would just like to point out right now, it's extremely poor. Please don't follow its pattern. A better version is on the Google documentation pages. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to grab a screenshot of them, but Google and Amazon also use them in their search results. So just occasionally, you might see a box that pops up, well, it doesn't pop up, appears in the sidebar, that says, were these search results useful to you, fundamentally? So why are big companies using them? Why are they valuable? Well, they catch user feedback at the point of success or failure for what someone is trying to achieve. They give us on-the-spot feedback about user interactions. Now, this is actually extremely difficult feedback to capture, even if we're doing usability testing. Because the problem with things like usability testing is that we never actually see users face the problem in a real-world scenario. Whereas what we're doing with a transaction audit is putting the feedback form out there and waiting for a real-life scenario to happen to capture that feedback. So as part of our audits, we can also choose to ask users for more information if they say they didn't find what they were looking for or they were unhappy. And with this information that they will often provide to us, we can actually use this to identify things like missing content or a particularly bad pain point in a user journey. And as I was talking about in the context of bug reports and complaints, they also give users an extremely simple route to feedback when they might not otherwise be motivated to tell us. Because if something's just a niggle, and we've all had them in their online products and services that we use, we're unlikely to take the time to report it unless we really, really care about the product. So the easier we make it to feedback, the more likely we are to identify those niggles for our users early. And actually, it tends to be those small niggles that build up over time and cause dissatisfaction with our services. So the earlier we can pin them, the better. So what does a transaction audit actually look like? Well, this is a simple example, and I'd say that this is the most effective pattern for a transaction audit that's trying to capture something like content or search result feedback. So did you find what you were looking for? Yes or no? If the user says yes, they did find what they were looking for, we thank them for their feedback and we submit the form. That's it. That's all we do. We know what we need to know. The user is satisfied with the experience they've just had. If the user selects no, then we reveal an additional free text field, expanding out and asking them what it is that they were looking for. Now, the key point here is at this point, we want to make the text field optional, but we also want to submit the response of no straight away. If someone chooses not to press that send button at the bottom of our form, we want to make sure that we've captured that someone is unhappy, even if we don't know exactly why. So if they do submit written feedback, we can update the record and thank them for their time. So that's it. It's an extremely simple pattern, but it's extremely useful. So if you're going to design a transaction audit, it's mostly important to remember that the simpler the question you ask and the less time it takes, the more likely you are to get responses. So we want to keep questions as simple and straightforward as possible. Now, do limit the amount of times that you ask for feedback on your transactions. If a user completes a transaction regularly, don't keep on asking them. Don't know if anyone ever had the Android Twitter app installed, but don't do what the Android Twitter app did. Every single time you dismissed a new feature, it would ask you whether or not you liked it, even if you had dismissed that feature 5 times already in the day. Now, not only does this annoy your users, as you can see, but it will also lead to less reliable results and feedback. When this feature was still live, I would randomly answer yes or no every time it asked me because I was just annoyed. And finally, we want to reserve our audits for our key user journeys or keep them discrete on our page for content feedback. So if we're talking about transactional journeys, something like shopping, then we want to make sure that we're maybe only using those audit methodologies for something that is a new feature, something that we want to test out and see how it's working, or at the very least that we don't keep on asking people if it's a repeated transaction. Users don't want to be asked every time they complete any kind of transaction on your site, so we don't want to put them across every single transaction either. Now, if we're testing something like content or search, which is one of the more common usages for this, it's a little bit more difficult to judge what the end of our journey is. We know if we've made a purchase, then we're probably at the end of our user journey. But if we're trying to find an answer to a question in content, or we're trying to find a particular search result, that's a bit trickier to judge. So it's important to put the audit somewhere that isn't going to distract users, but may catch their eye at an appropriate point for them to be able to feedback, such as under every piece of content, if you want to, or in the sidebar of your search results. So audits can be created from scratch. You can build them quite simply, or you can actually embed them using an external survey tool. And this is a really good, quick way to get started if you just want to see the value of the kind of feedback that this can offer. Now, it's going to give you less control over the visual presentation and behavior, but it's a really simple and quick way to prove the value of doing it. So if you're going to use a survey tool, then the only additional feature you'll need is branching, and that's so that you can show and hide the box. Not all survey tools actually have that capacity for free or in paid versions. And some tools also allow you to add an additional hidden field and submit content that way. Now, that's really useful if you need to add the audit form on multiple pages. For example, if you're trying to evaluate a bunch of your content, because it means you can pass through the name or the URL of your page or the search result that someone just asked for, so that you don't have to have 15 different versions of the transaction audit created in your survey tool. So I've used PollDaddy successfully to do this. Just obviously make sure if you've got hidden fields and you're passing information through that you're not connecting it up with anything identifiable or sensitive for your users in someone else's system. So that transaction audits do not become intrusive for our users, we should always make them optional. We should never block users from getting to complete a transaction that they want by forcing them to complete a survey or popping up something in their way. But for this reason, because we need to make them optional, transaction audits are not surveys. Now, they may look like surveys, we may use survey tools to build them, but it's important to understand that they will not give you the same kind of quantitative data that a well-designed survey will. And this is because our audit is optional, and that means our users are self-selecting. So they choose whether or not they want to respond. And quite honestly, they were more likely to respond as a result of a particularly good or bad transaction, rather than just because we've asked them to. Now, those individual motivations mean that we cannot assume that all of their opinions are representative of all of our users' experiences. So we cannot say with any confidence that 50% of users liked this page because we don't have a representative sample of users to start with. So we should consider them satisfaction gauges or red flags for underperforming transactions. They are an extremely valuable way of gathering insight, but they are not a way of accurately measuring the experience for everyone. It's just worth keeping in mind. So transaction audits can help you to gather feedback at the point of success or failure, helping us to understand if we're really fulfilling a need at the point at which a user tries to meet it. They can help us to identify unsatisfactory transactions, and we can leave them up for this purpose so we can see how our feedback changes over time. And we can receive continuous user feedback, which will help us to do things like understand how our user behavior or needs or reactions to our services do change over time, over multiple implementations, when bugs occur, when bugs don't occur, when we haven't updated our system in 5 years. So it's useful long-term feedback to see how that changes over time. So the dev time for implementation will obviously depend on whether or not you're going to roll your own or whether you use a survey tool, but using a survey tool should take you about 30 minutes to get spun up. Analysis for text responses, if you're really lucky and you get a lot of them, could take a couple of hours. But in reality, the bulk of your responses are going to be something like yes or no. So you have an immediate red flag if something is going wrong, and you can decide whether or not you want to do a deep dive into the rest of the analysis. So the last methodology that I'd like to talk to you about today is content and language analysis through search logs. So internal search logs are a rich and often untapped source of insights about behavior and user needs. And search logs are data that we all actually have fairly easily to hand. And we can use it for research straight away without really having to do much dev work at all. And search log analysis really reveals the value of something that seems quite negative when we see it in a user interface, which is search returned no results. But in reality, the data on failed searches can provide us with a multitude of insights on missing content, mismatches in language usage and categorization, and even indicate some potential usability issues. So search logs can help us to identify content missing from our site that users want or expect. And we can only do this through our internal search log data. We can't do it through something like Google Analytics if we're looking at our incoming natural search terms, for example. Now, the reason for this is our incoming search terms from Google will tell us how people got to our websites or our product or our service. But they won't tell us about the people who didn't get there. If we've got missing content, then it's likely that someone else captured our traffic and that user on that day. So we'll never find out. They can also help us to reveal when they're using different language or categorization than our users on our products and services. So a simple example of this would be that the site is using zucchini, but the website users are searching for something like courgette. And they can also give us an indication of how easy our popular content is to find. So through this, in some ways, we may be able to identify some usability issues. For example, actually, if we know that our most popular pages are hidden deep in the navigation, then it might be that there's an uneven weighting on how many people are using search for those particular topics, because they matter to them more. So I hope you all like sci-fi, because it's sci-fi all the way from here. Good. To give you an example of how to analyze search results, I've made up a relatively crappy website called aliensforever.com. Now, this is a site about alien races in science fiction, and that's going to be important in a minute. So I'm going to run you two simple approaches to analyzing these logs. So the first approach is to compare search queries with our existing pages with our sitemap. So the results in red here are the ones that don't currently return any results for our users when they type them in our internal search log. So why don't they return any results? Well, we can see that 7 of them aren't returning anything at the moment, and if we analyze the data, we can see there's a few different reasons for this, remembering that these are alien races that we're looking for. So these aren't alien races. This is the initial problem. The first is that the doctor is an individual. His race is Time Lord, so that's not coming up in the search results. The second is that AI and robots could be considered races, but they're non-biological, so the site owner doesn't consider them to be such. And the last one is that Jedis and Peacekeepers are groups containing multiple races. They're not individual races themselves, so they don't come up in the search results either. So this very quickly gives us our first finding, right? User language and categorization doesn't align with some of the site content. Our users have a mental model that they should be able to type in the doctor and get to Time Lords or information about the most prominent Time Lord, but that's not currently happening for them in the user interface. The second issue from this batch of results is that our 11th most popular search term is Delvian, which is a valid race from Farscape, if you've ever watched it. But there's currently no content about Delvians on the site because the site owner just hasn't produced any. So our second finding is that some of the content that users are looking for does not currently exist on the site. And this is a good example of how we may be missing out traffic for people searching in Google about Delvians to other sites about Delvians. The third issue is an unfortunate misspelling of Cardassian, which is a race from Star Trek, which gives us our third finding, which is that misspellings mean that some users can't find what they're looking for. Now, for findings like these, the scale of the search queries is quite important. If just one user has made this mistake, and I really hope it's just one user, then it's not a major problem. But if users are commonly making this mistake, then we might want to consider adding this to our search metadata so that people still end up on the page they want to be at. So the second analysis approach that we can take is to compare our most popular search queries to the top visited pages from our analytics package. Something like Google Analytics is fine. Now, both sources of data give us slightly different kinds of information or insights. Analytics tells us about the most visited pages, both from navigating internally and externally, and our internal search logs tell us what people are looking for once they actually are inside our website and using our UI. So we've got only 7 items from our top 20 list appearing in our top search for list. The fact that these two lists don't align isn't necessarily positive or negative, but it can reveal some potential insights on the way people are using different systems differently, and potentially some usability issues. So there could be a few reasons as to why these results are still coming up in red, and they don't quite align with what is in our top visited pages. It might be that we're, as I say, losing traffic to popular content for other sites in natural search. Now, obviously, it's not just missing content that causes this. It might be that other people have better content or better ranked content. It might be that some of our popular pages are harder to discover in the navigation, so people who would otherwise look within the UI will actually revert to search. Or it might be that the user interface is promoting some content, which means we're increasing the amount of page views of some content, possibly somewhat abnormally. So there are a few potential conclusions that we could take from these results. I'm going to say that I went and did the research, and actually the Aliens Forever UI is pretty poor. So our final finding is going to be that navigational routes to some popular content might be quite convoluted. We've got some pages hidden back in our information architecture that users can't get to as easily. So, just from that quick review of 20 results, we have 4 findings on language and categorization, missing content, and even one potential usability issue. So you can see, even with just a tiny bit of data, how much potential insight you can pull out of it. Now, if you're going to run one of these yourself, it is important to consider the time frame for your analysis. And the key factor here is, do external factors affect your traffic and search results? So an example for Aliens Forever might be that people have been searching for Jedis more in the last few months because of the new Star Wars movie. And this might be a useful insight if we understood this to be a temporary need. if our searches for Jedis haven't been consistent over the last 2 years, then it might be we need to temporarily bump this content, but actually reduce its prominence over time as the new Star Wars movies aren't live. But if we only looked at 2 months of data and saw this as a permanent user need, then it could be quite misleading. The second thing we want to consider is the size of our user base, and this will directly relate to the depth of analysis that we might find useful. Now, the more users we have, the more search queries we have being processed. And that means the more edge cases we're likely to find, particularly regarding things like categorization errors and misspellings. So it might be worth your time, if you've got quite a lot of users, to go deep. And if you have time, it's also worth just testing, actually, in the UI, both your top search results and your top visited pages. This is something that we don't do very often, and is often quite shocking when you do try it out, because we now know this content is popular, right? We know that our users are looking for it. So what do they actually see when they search for it in our own search? Do the pages appear at the top of the list, for example? If we know them to be popular, they probably should do. If they're not, then we can look at our search weighting and metadata to try and remedy that with some good, solid data to underpin it. So search logs analysis can help us to identify missing or difficult to find content. It can help us to identify non-user-friendly language or categorization. And it can even potentially reveal things like poor information architecture and usability issues that result from that information architecture being poor. So how much time does that actually take? Well, if you've got a content management system with a GUI, then this is a pretty quick one just to pull off the results from it. If not, the only dev time that we're looking at is just grabbing them out of the database. Obviously, that's going to take a little bit longer, but not substantially so. The analysis time depends on how deep you want to go in the search logs. But for an analysis of the top 20 terms using those two different methodologies, I wouldn't expect it to take more than an hour. So, today I have presented you with 3 different, simple-to-implement methods of user research using data that's easy to gather or already on hand that we already have ready access to. Now, if we implemented all 3 methods on any given project, then we could identify usability issues and reduce usability-related bug reports and complaints. We could gather continuous feedback on transaction success and satisfaction. And we could improve poor information architecture by aligning it to user language and categorization that is more natural to them. And the kicker is, using all of these methods on any given project would likely take less than 8 hours a month. And obviously, there's a lot of insight to be had here for not very much time or effort. Now, I will say that these aren't a replacement for face-to-face methodologies like user interviews or usability testing, but they will provide you with lightweight, ongoing, and valuable feedback to see how your users' experiences or needs or reactions may change over time, and to give you some data on which to base your design and development decisions. And I think for designers and developers, getting regular feedback from our users can also offer 3 very valuable extras. The first one is reduced uncertainty in the decisions that we make, design or development. Are we making the right call, or are we being forced by our highest paid opinion in the room to make the wrong one? And how do we know? They can offer us better outcomes because we start to understand how users really behave and what they really need. And we can know that the effort that we put into designing and building is going to have a more positive outcome for the people we're designing and building for. And perhaps most importantly for us, it can offer us less conflict with our stakeholders, our clients, and our colleagues, because we no longer have to focus on those subjective opinions that can lead us to opinion-driven design, that can lead us to conflict. We have objective data to focus on now. And we also have insight to guide our decisions, and it means we can push back if we feel that the project is getting too internally led rather than user need led. So in my opinion, user research is the key for opinion-driven design, and I genuinely encourage you all to go out and try some as soon as possible. Thank you very much.